Hi everyone, in this video we are going to talk about CSS Simple Selectors. CSS Simple Selectors, they are the Element Selector, the ID Selector, and the Class Selector. We have already talked about the Element Selector. We are going to cover it again, and we are going to talk about ID and Class Selectors as well. Now, first, let's go ahead and let's create some HTML elements so we can apply styles on them. I'm going to create an H1. And I'm going to say JavaScript. Now, for this, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Now, within the opening tag of any element, that's where you can apply, you can write either IDs or classes. Now, IDs and classes, they are ways to select this element. So, one way was to select it using its element name, right? So, H1, then you need to apply some style on it. The other way that you can select an HTML element is using an ID. The other one, there are like a lot of ways that you can select HTML elements. The reason that there are a lot of ways is because sometimes some elements are repetitive. So within your website, you will have definitely more than one section. So you cannot just select it with the section name, right? So if you select it like section and then apply some styles, those styles will be applied on all of your sections. And that is not something that you want. For the most part, what you want is you want to select each section uniquely so you can apply unique styles only on that section. For the next section, you will definitely have different styles. So you want to be very, very specific when it comes to selecting your HTML elements. The more specific you become, the better it is, but not too specific, okay? Because too specific means you will end up using inline styles, which is not a best practice. So each of these selectors, they have their specific application. And as we go through this CSS section of this tutorial series, and as we get to our projects, you're going to understand more and more of these. I cannot just go ahead and explain all of them in just one video. That is going to be silly. So let's go ahead and let's write ID. And I'm going to give it main-title. So this is going to be the main title of our web page. And I'm going to grab a paragraph. I'm going to create, let's say, lorem 50. And within the opening tag of this element, I'm going to create a class. Now this, and I'm going to call this one main para. Now this ID main title and this class main para, we know that from our HTML knowledge that these are actually HTML attributes. But we could select this H1 with this title, with this ID, and we could select this paragraph with this class as well. So let's save all of this. Let's come into our CSS. So we are talking about simple selectors. In simple selectors, we have element selectors, which we have talked about before. Then we have ID selectors, and then we have class selectors. There is just one more thing that I need to tell you about this ID and classes. The difference between ID and classes is that classes could be repeated more than once. So one class could be shared across multiple elements. For example, if you have two paragraphs, like let's say you have another paragraph here, you could share one class between these two paragraphs. So you could provide your element with more than one class. And the way that you can separate different classes is by providing a space. You could provide this element with a class of main para as well as para. And you could provide this one with the class of para. Now, what is the benefit here? The benefit here is there might be some styles that you just want to apply on this paragraph, on this main paragraph, but there might be some other styles that will be shared by this paragraph and by this paragraph. In that case, if you want to apply them individually, you're going to end up with repetitive code. So it's a best practice to combine these styles and apply them on all your paragraphs that you want to have those specific styles. Now, this you cannot do with IDs. Technically, you could do it, but it's not a best practice. IDs are unique. You can never repeat one ID. And it is a best practice to have one ID, one very unique ID for one very unique HTML element. Now, we know from our HTML knowledge that H1 is a very unique element. There is no other element like this H1 in our entire page. There is just one H1 per website. That is the allowed criteria to be used for web development. You need to keep that in mind. Therefore, it is a bad practice to use classes for H1s. You have to use an ID for an H1. That is a best practice. You could use a class. I mean, it's not that big a deal. Technically, you can do it when it comes to web development, but it is a best practice to use IDs with unique elements. With repetitive elements, you might have like 10 paragraphs in your HTML. Then you could use like classes for that, and that is a best practice. The reason that I'm telling you all this is because the more you take these best practices into consideration, the more professional your code is going to look like. Now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this paragraph, and let's get back to work. So I'm going to grab this section that we have here. Now grabbing this section is using the element selector. So in simple selectors, we have element selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors. Let me provide some space so they're not confusing. If you select an element by its name, it's an element selector. And I'm going to give it a background color of light gray. This is a color name. There we go. We have light gray. Now let's grab the title of our web page, the H1, using its ID. So to be able to use an ID, you need to provide the number sign, the hash sign, the hashtag, whatever you want to call it. And then the name of that and the value for that ID. What is the value for the ID? It says main title. So first, you need to grab and provide the number sign and then the value for that ID, and that is main title. And we could say font size. This is going to either enlarge or delarge, whatever that is. You can make it bigger or smaller, your titles. So if I put it to 35 pixels, you can see it just went bigger a little bit. How can we select an element with its classes? You need to provide a dot, main-para. And now we have selected this paragraph element. You could see this is an ID selector, this is a class selector. And we are going to say font weight. Let's put it to bold. And there we go. Now this font for this paragraph, it is a little bit bold. It's a little bit like thicker, bigger, and it means that you want to emphasize on this certain text that you have written here. Now, don't worry if these topics, they seem a little bit overwhelming. They're not. They're very, very simple. All they need from you, all they require from you is just practice. Just go ahead, fire up your VS Code or whatever text editor that you're using, and just get to work. If you do not write HTML elements, you will never learn HTML. The same goes for CSS. The same goes for JavaScript, and the same goes for this full stack web development that you might want to get into, or front end or back end, whatever. You need to get to work. You need to get your hands dirty with coding. You need to code regularly. Then these elements, they're going to click, and you're going to understand what their value, what their meaning is, and why you're doing what you're doing. That's it for this lecture. See you in the next one.